Once the domestication of plants and animals had begun, men seem to have needed time to become accustomed to their great achievement in the Near East, as they did in the Tehuacan Valley. The farming villages changed very slowly over the millennia from 7,000 down to and past 4,000. So massive changes come in just a few 100-year period. Towns suddenly pop up. Permanent settlements, agriculture, just in a few 100-year period. Then this is it. This is the model for 3,000 years. The concept of agriculture, however, was easily transmitted and was rapidly seized by other people. In part, the spread of agriculture from its home in the Near East may have reflected the expansion of its own population based on the greater food resources. But more often, other food-gathering people probably picked up the idea via the thin lines of prehistoric trade. Like I said, which was mostly for luxuries and stuff. Eastward, farming turns up in northern China along the Yellow River, the Yellow, not the Yalu, the Yellow River by the 3rd millennium. So that's 4,000 years after it shows up in the Middle East, in the Near East as they call it here. 4,000 years later it comes to China. The early styles of Chinese pottery have at times been linked with those of the Near East and South Russia, but true proof of any connection remains to be found. Greece and the southern Balkans had farming villages almost as soon as in the Near East by the 7th millennium. Northern and Central Europe was held back by the widespread forests and the presence of much different continental climate. Now later on, when that climate changed a bit, it became more susceptible to farming. Whereas the early inhabitants of Western Europe seem at times to have been more advanced, as in cave painting, the population of the area north of the Alps remained in a backwater from 10,000 BC until the time of Christ. They were still hunter-gatherers. In and after the 6th millennium, peasant cultivators made their way up the Danube in a technique of slash and burn, moving on when the roughly cleared land was exhausted for farming purposes. Probably agriculture also spread westward by sea to other districts of Europe. There were farmers in Britain by 3500 BC. South of the Sahara, however, agriculture did not become common until the 1st millennium BC, the 1000 BC. It took another 1,500 years to jump over the Sahara after it had already gotten clear up to Britain. Alright, so that brings us to the end of the spread of agriculture. Next we're going on to talk about, a little bit about dating things. The farmers of the Near East had developed their agriculture techniques, their social structures, and their numbers so that they were ready to leap once more, this time to the level of actual civilization. We'll get on into that in a minute, but first we have to stop in this little essay called Dating the Past. And I'm going to skip virtually, probably half of it. I'm going to skip over half of it and only read part of the second half. One of the most notable recent techniques was announced in 1949 by Willard Libby, a technique of dating archaeological remains. He received a Nobel Prize for this discovery. The method entails measurement in organic deposits of carbon-14, that small part of carbon which is radioactive. I didn't know that until I'd read it in this book. When living matter ceases to grow, it stops adding carbon-14 to replace that which has been disintegrating. So we have carbon-14 in us, and when it disintegrates, our body puts more in there. Since this radioactive form of carbon has a half-life of 5,730 years, plus or minus 40 years, analysts can find the decrease of this element in an organic substance such as charcoal and can thereby locate the approximate age of this material. Theoretically, carbon-14 dating can be extended back to about 70,000 BC, but prior to 50,000 BC, the residue is usually too small to be properly measured. Extensive determination of carbon-14 dates have pretty firmly established the chronological pattern of early Homo sapiens and later Neanderthal man, so that we can relate chronologically a site like Shanidar in Iraq with another in Czechoslovakia, such as the Dolní Věstonice. Naturally, the historian cannot trust any one carbon-14 date, for the material tested may have been contaminated or otherwise given an erroneous date. And, it says in parentheses, statistically, a carbon-14 date has 2 chances in 3 of being approximately accurate. 1 chance in 3 of being wildly inaccurate. More recently, it has been discovered that potassium-40 disintegrates at a regular rate into calcium-40 and argon-40, potassium dating, you've heard of this. Since radioactive potassium has a half-life of 1.3 billion years, this method can be used especially for eras before 500,000 BC, such as the earlier levels of Olduvai Gorge and other Australopithecine remains. When one adds tests based on nuclear fission tracks and paleomagnetism, doesn't go over them, don't know what it is clear that scientists have created a considerable arsenal of dating skills. And we also want to spend, that's the end of that essay on dating, we also want to spend some time, a pretty good essay on cave painting, cave art, because this is from about the same time period when farming was beginning. So it's a look into the minds of what those people sort of were capable of, even if not the same people were doing. So cave art. Very soon after his appearance in Western Europe, Homo sapiens began to decorate rock shelters and caves. Earlier, he had apparently painted his own body and engaged in tattooing. Then he turned to improving his environment artistically. During the period from 28,000 to 10,000 BC, over 112 sites in France and Spain received more or less elaborate attention. For so long a span of time, this is not a great number, but the decoration is amazing. Right, 112 sites over 18,000 years. That's like one site every 800 years or something. That's not very great, but for so long a span of time. Oh, the painted bowls in the cave at Altamira were discovered in 1879, but it took until the end of the century before all scholars accepted the fact that this art was very early. Some people didn't think that it was that old. From the rock shelters, we have mainly incised or engraved figures, sometimes in low relief, for real painting was not likely to survive in an open atmosphere. Elsewhere, one can wind along limestone cave tunnels, occasionally crawling on hands and knees, or again mounting a chimney into yet another passage, a tall tube-like structure, not very big opening. And finally there will come a hidden cavern or recess with painting after painting. In a few places, clay sculptures have been found. Now pause for just a second. Most of these caves are found in places with limestone geography, and the limestone gets these caves by having lakes or rivers or whatever, bodies of water that trickle down through the limestone, and once a little tunnel gets opened and starts taking a constant trickle of water, it opens further and further and further, and over the years you get the existence of tunnels, and then once in a while their source of water is cut off and they're left dry. There are very massive tunnel systems, natural cave systems throughout the world. Okay, usually the objects that they find in these caves are animals. Out of 2,188 examples, which one scholar counted, it's quite a few examples, over half were horses and bison. Next followed mammoths, ibexes, and wild oxen. So half were horses and bison. But there were also woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, even one rabbit, and a few fish and birds. Human beings occur sometimes. There are also signs which have been taken to be traps, huts, or symbols of male and female. If one finds a group of animals, they do not ordinarily seem arranged in a composition. In fact, they can be drawn on top of other animals. That's very strange that you would actually impose your next animal on top of this one. Must have been some absolutely non-understandable rationalization, possibly, or who knows what. They can be drawn on top of other animals, shown in different sizes, or placed sideways and upside down at the pleasure of the artist. The paints were made from natural earth pigments and are